It really is a great pleasure to be here, and I'm thankful to Jane for once again forcing me to do some work that I probably would not have otherwise have done. She's like that, and we've got quite a lot to try and work our way through. I'll try and do it as efficiently as I can, and I certainly want time to hear from you and have interaction, and we'll see how we go with that. People are still coming in. People over here, if you want to move, you may. This whiteboard will be using only briefly, and the camera needs it in that position. So if you want to move, feel free to do that. If you stay there, it doesn't really matter. You won't miss out on much. Let's begin. Our Lord Jesus said, "Blessed are you when others revile you and utter all kinds of evil against you falsely on my account." And again he said, "If the world hates you, know that it hated me before it hated you. If you were of the world would love you as its own. But because you are not of the world, but I chose you out of the world, therefore the world hates you." A little later he prayed, "I have given them your word, and the world has hated them because they are not of the world, just as I am not of the world. I do not ask that you take them out of the world, but that you keep them from the evil one." And then later in the New Testament we hear from the Apostle Peter about how a believer must live in such a world. "Keep your conduct among the nations honourable, so that when they speak against you as evildoers, they may see your good deeds and glorify God on the day of visitation." The Apostle Paul wrote about the shape of ministry in such a world. "We are not waging war according to the flesh, for the weapons of our warfare are not of the flesh, but have divine power to destroy strongholds. We destroy arguments and every lofty opinion raised against the knowledge of God, and take every thought captive to obey Christ." And Jesus' promise, on which we rely as we serve in such a world, is this: "Everyone who acknowledges me before men, I also will acknowledge before my Father who is in heaven." Friends, what I'm hoping to do in our time together this afternoon is threefold. First, I want to spend a little time thinking with you about how our world, so different in so many ways from the world in which those words were first uttered, is nonetheless living up to Jesus' words. And I want us to think about how that is impacting Christian people and Christian witness in our day. I'm trying to reflect on our relation to the world in which we find ourselves and the relationship of that world to us. What's going on? Secondly, we will consider briefly the positives and the negatives of how we Christians are responding to this situation in our day. And thirdly, I'd like to make some suggestions that might help us to get what's going on and perhaps to understand a little more of what faithfulness means. So that's the sort of pattern of the rest of our time in this session. Time will be not divided equally, but you'll see how we get there. There are a number of caveats that I'd like to make as I begin. I'm very conscious that I'm paddling in the shallows of some very deep issues this afternoon, and that's all I can manage at this stage. It's probably all I can manage at any stage, but I want to acknowledge that most things we will talk about are much more complex than my brief comments might suggest. And I'm very aware that others are discussing these matters from a variety of helpful points of view, far more thoroughly than I'm able to do here. And to explore some of those, do visit John Anderson's website. Do listen to some of the material that Nick brought us earlier this morning as well. Furthermore, I am concerned that the kind of discussion that I'm embarking on with you this afternoon can very easily be turned into a kind of Christian victim mentality. We must not go there. However hard it is for us to be Christian today, and it is hard, it is very, very far from the worst of times. We sometimes need to remind ourselves of that. I think actually the opposite is closer to the truth. It is a brilliant time to be Christian. Furthermore, I'm aware that this will be a discussion that may seem less relevant for those living and working for Christ in cross-cultural situations, because the world that we'll be thinking about is largely the so-called Western world. But that's a big part of the world, and it's impacting the rest of the world, and I don't actually think that any of us are untouched by the things that we're going to be talking about. I've also noticed that the kind of issues I want to raise today can become all-absorbing in themselves and sort of take us away from our main game. That's not my purpose. My purpose is to help us to play our main game well. Well, is that enough of displaying my nervousness about what I'm doing and my unease? I'm sure there are other qualifications that I should make. That'll become clear as we proceed, I'm sure. Let's begin with some reflections on being a Christian in the world in which we find ourselves today, under the rather unpromising heading, "When they speak against you as evildoers." It seems to me, and I think this has already been raised in very helpful ways already in our program today, but I think that a very good candidate for the issue of our times for Christian believers, at least in so-called Western societies, is this. Many, many people in this world, at this time, in this culture, if you like, find it almost impossible to see God's word to us and God's ways with us as good. Isaiah's words have a strange resonance when he spoke of those who call evil good and good evil, who put darkness for light and light for darkness, who put bitter for sweet and sweet for bitter. Christians, almost by definition, are people who are convinced that God, God's word, God's ways are not only true and not only right, but they are good. However, we are living in a time when many, many ordinary people, and I'm not just talking about the obviously anti-Christian activists or the angry atheists, but many ordinary people, you know, the sort of people who listen to Richard Glover, see things that you and I believe are good as evil. And although this situation is not entirely new, in relatively recent times, many of us have simply been overwhelmed and thrown off balance by the extent and the depth of this phenomenon. This way of thinking has rapidly become familiar, respectable, and dominant. It's mainstream. It's the air we breathe. They speak against us, we who love God's word and God's ways, as evildoers. And as we breathe this air, it can become difficult, even for Christian believers, to see the goodness of God's ways. Now, let me illustrate with an example that is uncomfortable, and I'm afraid it's also been touched on a number of times today already, but in a sense, its discomfort is the point. Consider the idea that we were talking about earlier today, that we find a number of times in the New Testament. Just think about it now, forgetting all the things that Nick told us, but remembering them later on, but for the moment just putting them to one side. Just consider the idea in the New Testament, the idea of Christian wives submitting to their husbands. And I reckon even at this conference, and even after all that Nick has so helpfully brought to us, I'm reasonably sure that you, like me, when you're honest, can see how terribly awkward that idea feels in today's world. It's worse than awkward because, frankly, it doesn't feel right. It doesn't feel good. It doesn't feel appropriate. The idea, wives submitting to their husbands, did not feel as terrible for most of our grandparents. It's worth reflecting on that. Thinking has clearly changed. What do we make of that? Well, we're enlightened, we like to imagine. We're enlightened in ways that our grandparents were not. We tend to think, become sensitised to injustices that they seem to have tolerated. The ways of thinking that make the idea of wives submitting to their husbands simply unacceptable, those ways of thinking are obviously superior. And I think we want to say morally superior. Again, as Nick helped us see this morning, we call this progress. Now, the point of raising this particular controversial idea is not to focus on the issue as such, but simply to illustrate how aspects of the Bible's teaching that may have caused little reaction not so long ago have become highly offensive in the world in which we find ourselves. And my point is that this is now the case with much of the Bible's teaching. And I want to just get your help for a moment, and let's put a list on the board here of examples of biblical teaching that Bible believers know in our heads must be true because we are convinced that the Bible is God's word. But in our hearts, we don't feel comfortable with them. We don't feel they're okay, where we find them embarrassing in a particular way, morally embarrassing. I think the word is offensive, but offensive in a moral sense, morally offensive, and we feel it. Okay, just shout out from where you are. You don't need a microphone or anything. Give me a Bible teaching that fits into that category. I'll just put submission as our first one while you're thinking. And what are the words you put over here? What is it?
The exclusivity of Christ.
Yes, I'll come to that. But it's offensive because it is inequality. Okay, that's what we want. Thanks, John. The exclusivity of Christ. Wonderful writing here. Is offensive because bigoted? Intolerant. Keep on going. Another biblical teaching. Yes. Shout out. Don't worry. Homosexuality. Okay. How about I just put Christian teaching about sexual morality? Will that do? We'll just generalise. Otherwise, we'll have a whole long list of them. Sexual. How do you spell that? Morality. So, Christian teaching, Bible teaching on sexual morality. Why is it so offensive in today's world? It's outdated. Yeah, that's perhaps not as bad as it gets. It's oppressive. That's
That's my private issue.
It's
my private issue. It's not
private. None of your business. Yep. Okay. Another one.
Good. Some good people may go to hell.
Okay. Hell. God's judgment. Isn't it fun? I don't think we need to debate whether that is offensive today. Just ask Israel Folau. Offensive because it is hateful. Would that be right? What are the words that were used about Israel? Hateful. Yeah. That'll do. Harmful. Harmful because you tell people. Yeah. Yep.
not just offending, we're harming them.
Yep.
Church is offensive because
Okay, this is because?
it's
Controlling, okay. Here's one. What do you think of this one? Forgiveness. You tried to suggest the idea that if somebody makes a mistake that they'd be forgiven? That that's the way we deal with this? Somebody did something that is seen to be wrong 30 years ago and it's come to light. How about we deal with that by forgiveness rather than destroying them? Don't do that anymore, do we? Forgotten how to forgive. I think forgiveness is offensive. I'm not quite sure why. Unjust. I suppose that, yeah, thank you. Unjust. But what we really mean is it doesn't allow us to take vengeance. So justice and vengeance have got all mixed up. Now, that's the kind of picture. We could go on and on, I'm sure. But I'm wanting to suggest that what we're reflecting on here is different from the embarrassment that many Christians felt about their faith as I was growing up, which was a long time ago. But back in those days, it was more of an intellectual embarrassment. How could you possibly believe in miracles and a virgin birth and a resurrection and heaven and hell and so on? The idea that was around was that science could in principle explain everything and God was therefore an unnecessary hypothesis. And those who clung to belief in God just lacked the courage or the intellectual equipment to follow through the logic of scientific discovery. The Enlightenment, it was supposed, was the beginning of the end of all religion. Reason had replaced faith. Now, back in those days, that most of you can't remember, but back in those days, believers tended to respond with rational arguments. For the reasonableness of our faith, we argued that reason and Christian faith were friends, not enemies, and we developed a great body of thinking that we called apologetics. That was then. Today, I'm suggesting we have a different kind of embarrassment. Not so much that science has challenged our faith, that's still around, of course, in the preaching of the angry atheists, the Dawkins, Hitchens, Harris and so on, but a new moral framework has taken hold within which the Bible's teachings seem unjust, oppressive, exclusive, bigoted, hateful, intolerant, cruel. I'm not sure whether I got all those words up there, but those are just some of the terms that have become commonplace to describe Christian views learnt from the Bible, all of them synonyms for evil. The older apologetics, while still essential, it's not enough to meet the new situation. We cannot be satisfied if our message seems to be that something that is unjust, oppressive, exclusive, bigoted, hateful, intolerant and cruel is nonetheless true. That's not our message. In that former age that I mentioned a moment ago, evangelism was difficult because as soon as you identified yourself as a Christian believer, you felt that people would think you were stupid. The Christian gospel had been intellectually discredited, so it was thought. And I think that was hard enough. But it seems to me that it's harder, a lot harder, if you feel that people will think you are evil. When the Christian gospel feels morally discredited, if you really believe that, you're a bad person. You're bigoted, hateful, intolerant, and all the rest. And it's not just evangelism. In my recent experience, it seems to me that many of our young people in our churches are struggling with their Christian faith at precisely this point. They are living with a tension that they find very difficult. And it's not just young people. And teachers of God's word, it seems to me, have a big, challenging, but very, very important job to do. In this context, we need to learn how to so teach the word of God that those who believe can see not just its truth, but its goodness, its moral goodness. For I don't believe it's possible to believe the truth and not love the truth. You haven't got it if you don't love it. The problem is not really new. Those New Testament texts that I started off with make that clear. we seem to be returning to a kind of challenging situation Christianity faced from the very beginning. A few months ago, I was discussing this kind of things with a friend in Cambridge who is a classics teacher, and he came back to me the next day and pointed me to Tacitus, as classics teachers do, and Tacitus, so we're talking about end of 1st century, beginning of 2nd century, referred to the Christians as haters of mankind. Actually, my classics teacher friend gave it to me in Latin, then realised I was an Australian and translated it for me. Haters of mankind. I would not be at all surprised to hear some people today endorsing Tacitus's words. Haters of mankind. That's what you Christians are for this stuff. I'm not sure precisely what Tacitus meant, and I'm really glad to say my classics teacher didn't know that either. But I have discovered that in the early days of the Christian faith, many Romans saw, for example, Christian sexual morality as evil. Because the very idea that a person in power should not take sexual pleasure wherever and however he wanted was offensive. So, if the Christian message, or at least particular aspects of it, have become morally offensive to many of our contemporaries, what should we do about it? Some of us, perhaps almost without thinking about it too much, just do our best to avoid the problem by ignoring or playing down the Bible teachings that are giving offence. So you talk about God's love for everyone, you talk about kindness and generosity, but you put the offensive things to one side. And my impression is that in many Christian circles today, we hear a lot less about the Bible teaching on this list, or what this list could be if we kept extending it, than we did at an earlier time. We're not denying these things. We're not liberals. We're just ignoring them to avoid offending people. Isn't that thoughtful of us? We want people to see, we really do want people to see the goodness of Christianity, so we try to keep the things that they see as evil in the background. But as you can see, just by putting it like that, it's not entirely honest, is it? We are living in denial of the problem, never a good long-term strategy, and it cannot possibly end well. Better than that is the response that does some critical thinking about our understandings of biblical teachings that cause such offence today. Perhaps it's not the biblical teaching as such that causes offence, but our insensitive, superficial, out-of-date misunderstandings of those teachings. In the light of today's sensitivities, can we rethink what submission means so that it will no longer cause offence? Can we think again about sexual morality and what the Bible really counts as immorality, and so on and so on and so on? And might we find that the Bible's teachings are actually less offensive than people think? And up to a point, I want to say that's a right thing to do. It's more than likely that we have misunderstood to some degree and in some ways some of the Bible's teachings. We are not infallible. And this may have something to do with our insensitivity to issues that have more recently become sensitive. Perhaps today we can see inadequacies in our earlier understandings of a number of things. Now, I think I myself have gone through a process something like that in my understanding of that idea of submission. As I've tried to understand what submission in marriage means in the relevant biblical texts, in their contexts, I found myself wondering, why is it that we are not agonising just as much over what love means when husbands are told to love their wives? Now, Nick was touching on this earlier on. But do you really think that the Bible's teaching about the true and proper relationship of a husband to his wife is actually less controversial, less unacceptable, less offensive in today's world than the Bible's teaching about the true and proper relationship of a wife to her husband. It's just that the world has not yet come around to being offended by the Bible's idea of love. But it probably should be. What the Bible's teaching expects of a Christian husband is at least as troubling in today's climate as what the Bible teaches about a Christian wife, and I don't think it's possible to rightly understand one without the other. I'll come back to that a little later on. But rethinking what might have been our inadequate understandings of biblical teachings is not enough. Not if it involves an uncritical acceptance of the enlightened moral sensitivities of our time, and not if it's driven by those sensitivities, because it is at least as likely that there are problems with the moral framework that has made so many Christian ideas seem unjust or oppressive or bigoted or whatever, and revising biblical teaching to make it acceptable to today's moral framework is upside down thinking. It makes the Bible dance to the world's tune. Not a good idea. But some of us, I think, find it all too hard. And we try to attack the problem by ignoring the problem. We affirm our understanding of the Bible's teaching, often forcefully and repeatedly, and we simply don't care if it doesn't feel right. We might go to great lengths to ensure and to demonstrate that our understanding is indeed biblical. The Bible does teach this idea, and that settles the matter. How you might feel about it really isn't important. Sometimes we might even feel a bit virtuous by putting a lot of emphasis on a biblical idea precisely because it's an idea that people feel uncomfortable with today. And the more the world hates the idea, the more we affirm it. We're defending biblical Christianity precisely where it is under attack. And sticking with our example, in some of our circles, we might think that we're defending biblical Christianity by emphasising submission whenever we talk about Christian marriage. We beat the drum, not really caring about the problems that that word causes for many people today. As long as we keep using the Bible's words in the Bible's way, we're being biblical, we're being faithful, we're being courageous, and we're defending God's good purposes for marriage against the attacks of the world. Likewise, Bible's teaching about sex. As long as we're against what the Bible's against and for what the Bible is for, we're being faithful. And again, although I think I'm caricaturing a little bit, that is a right thing to do up to a point. But I believe we need to be careful. Because many of us, I think most of us under a certain age, but I haven't got round to defining what that age is, almost all of us, under whatever that age is, have absorbed the climate of thought that surrounds us so deeply that this approach of simply forcefully affirming the Bible's teachings can involve a kind of suppression of our consciences. At worst, we're forcing ourselves to believe something, to believe it's true, while believing, or at least feeling, it's not good. Although perhaps we would never be quite game to say so. And I do think we should be particularly sensitive to this as we teach young people. We cannot be content with Christians being people who believe things that they feel are unjust, oppressive, exclusive, bigoted, hateful, and intolerant, and so on. Believing the truth must involve loving the truth. And so we must not only affirm the biblical truth, We must address the ways of thinking that we have absorbed that may prevent us from delighting in the truth. And I want to take some small steps towards doing something like that in the remainder of our time. What I'd like to do with you, and this really is only the beginning of thinking, that's all I can manage, and I'd like to use the lack of time as the excuse. It's not, it's more about the lack of ability, but I wanted to just begin this exploration. I want to explore a couple of ideas with some care, and then I'll suggest where this kind of thinking might helpfully go. And it seems to me a convenient place to start is how we think these days about the value and dignity of human life. Two closely related ideas are at the heart of the moral thought world that we are inhaling: rights and equality. Let's think for a little while, firstly, about rights, human rights. Countries like Australia are often said approvingly to have developed a rights culture. In contrast to totalitarian regimes where human rights are frequently violated and very often the very notion is repudiated. And I think it's true that the paradigm for many Westerners is the civil rights movement of the 50s and 60s in the United States. Martin Luther King Jr., I Have a Dream, and so on. And for the avoidance of any doubt or misunderstanding, an enormous amount of good has been accomplished in the name of human rights. But something has happened. Something has happened to the idea of human rights, where once it was significantly motivated and supported by biblical references and allusions. Just listen to any Martin Luther King speech, including I Have a Dream. That was then, but now the notion of rights has become a key idea in the repudiation of much biblical teaching as immoral. A powerful part of the offence that is taken to the idea of submission in marriage comes from the sense that a woman's rights are being violated. What's happened? The idea of human rights goes back at least to the canon lawyers of the Middle Ages. It was based on biblical ideas. Human rights were understood to be rights applying to every human because they derived from God, in whose image every human was created. And the idea of human rights became possible because of the spread of Christianity. The idea was refined in the 18th century Enlightenment. The English philosopher John Locke had argued in the previous century for the natural rights of life, liberty, and estate, that is, property, which government ought not to deny its citizens. Through the 18th century, there were the revolutions in America and France, which led to declarations of human rights, the most famous of which states, and you could almost recite it with me as though it was a biblical verse, I think, we hold these truths to be self-evident, that all men are created equal and that they are endowed by their Creator with certain unalienable rights, and that among these are life, liberty, and the pursuit of happiness. As I was doing some work and looking this up, I was interested in what did the pursuit of happiness mean? And it might be worth, just as a sort of footnote here, to note that it did not mean, in that context, the pursuit of pleasure, but as one writer has put it, happiness meant that feeling of self-worth and dignity that you acquire by contributing to your community and its civic life. It's a rather different idea altogether, isn't it? The pursuit of happiness. Well, in 1948, as I'm sure we all know, partly in response to the horrors of World War II, the General Assembly of the newly established United Nations adopted the Universal Declaration of Human Rights. And many nations today have their Bill of Rights, and there are numerous human rights commissions. And the upshot is that the idea of human rights today in our rights culture has two significant features. First, it has lost any conscious dependence on the biblical teaching that made the idea possible. Locke's idea that these rights are natural and the notion that they are self-evident and universal has displaced any need to refer to God. And second, the number and kind of rights have vastly multiplied and continue to do so. And what I think we're witnessing is the consequences of the Enlightenment that have taken several centuries to unravel. The Enlightenment was a movement dependent on biblical teaching and at the same time a departure from biblical teaching. And human rights became a way of holding on to what the Bible had given to Western civilization, namely an understanding of the value and dignity of human life unknown to previous civilizations, while rejecting the Bible's basis for this truth. And a big part of what I'm wanting to say this afternoon is it seems to me that cannot work. Sooner or later, the idea that depended on the truth that lay behind it will be corrupted when it's detached from that truth. And that seems to be what has happened. And the problem, if not the reason for it, has become obvious to a number of observers. There are now calls for the very idea of human rights to be rethought. It was in September, I think I saw an article in The Economist calling for precisely that. For who decides? And how can we decide what is and what is not a human right? It's become very far from self-evident. And in our rights culture, various movements for social change, without a lot of thought, certainly not without any argument, certainly without a lot of argument, take the language of rights to describe their cause. So it's become the case that any desirable outcome can be called a right. Of course, most prominent in recent times have been women's rights, gay rights, and now trans rights. And you will have noticed how the abortion and euthanasia debates have been cast in terms of rights on both sides. It's hardly an exaggeration to say that rights have become whatever the spokespeople for a group or a cause want. And this is part of the intensity of contemporary debates about social change. Because if it's about a right, if it's about a human right, that ups the ante considerably, and it makes consideration of the change difficult or impossible. It makes it a matter of justice. Therefore, only a bad person could disagree, someone who's on the side of injustice. Seen that in the same-sex marriage debates. Opponents were seen not just as resisting a change to the definition of marriage or conserving the form of a valued social institution, they were denying people a right, making it about justice. And the denial becomes an injustice. And so many Christians found themselves feeling decidedly uncomfortable because, you see, you cannot be indifferent to justice, to righteousness, if you take the God who really is there seriously. I have a theory that one of the fundamental reasons that many people regard the Bible as offensive is that the Bible does not really support the rights culture as it has developed. One of the things we might find embarrassing about the Bible is that it does not teach, at least not in explicit and in those terms, does not teach human rights. The Bible is not a human rights document. Not really. But that is because the Bible has a better way to understand the value and dignity of human life. And it's this: human life is a gift given by God out of his love. The appropriate attitude of those who've received this gift is thankfulness. And being so loved imbues human life with the wonderful dignity of responsibility towards the one who has so loved us and towards others who've been so loved. How good is that? The rights culture, as it has developed, leads to the divisions, demands and resentments that surround us. What do we want? When do we want it? The biblical reality opens up the possibility of thankfulness, love, responsibility towards others, and contentment. You could call it a love culture. It would not by any means be indifferent to injustice, but it might not see everything desired as a right. Now, don't misunderstand me. I'm not suggesting for a moment that this Christian way of thinking gives us immediate and simple answers to the issues of our times. I don't believe it means that we will automatically come down on one side or the other of any particular issue. But it does mean that we see human life in better terms than demanding or defending what we claim to be our rights. The idea of human rights is closely tied to a second idea that has massive moral power today: equality. The two ideas are linked, of course. They're linked historically and they're linked logically because the very notion of human rights entails equal rights. White people do not have more rights than black people. Men do not have more rights than women. Human rights, if they're human rights, must apply equally everywhere to everyone. But perhaps even more than rights, equality is widely accepted today, at least in Western societies, as self-evident, natural, and universal, and a moral truth. Inequality is immoral. And again, for the avoidance of doubt or confusion, an enormous amount of good has been accomplished in the name of equality. But in a manner similar to rights, equality is an important and good concept that has been corrupted by being detached from its roots. It was the Christian conviction that all human life is created in God's image that gave the world the astonishing and in fact very far from self-evident truth of human equality. The case for this has been elegantly restated in the book that was referred to earlier by John, I think, that Tom Holland's Dominion, Making of the Western Mind. It's really a history of the impact of Christian thought on the world. I think it's a book that should be widely read. I noticed that Carl's got a couple of copies in the bookshop there. It is a thick book. It's a reasonably heavy book, but it is very readable. And I think a good number of us, perhaps not all of us have to read it, but a good number of us should read it. Holland makes clear that whatever debt we owe to the Greeks and the Romans and so on, it's not for the idea of human equality. That came to us from the gospel proclaimed by the Apostle Paul. A similar argument has been presented lucidly in another book, an earlier book by Larry Siedentop, I've listed these on the notes, called Inventing the Individual, the Origin of Western Liberalism. But the argument of both these books is really that before and apart from the influence of Christianity, cultures were built on the far more obvious idea of natural inequality. And isn't it perfectly obvious that humans aren't equal? We're not equally tall, we're not equally strong, we're not equally intelligent, we're not equal. Human inequality is far more obvious. Where do you get this idea of human equality from? It was introduced to the world, as Holland argues, by the gospel preached by the Apostle Paul. But today, the idea of equality has become the basis for rejecting much of Paul's teaching and Bible teaching more generally as morally offensive. The offence taken at the idea of submission in marriage comes very largely from the sense that it's a very paradigm of inequality and therefore deeply immoral. So what's happened? Well, the idea that we are equal before each other because we are equal before God, equally valued, equally loved, equally responsible and so on, that idea is and historically has been a very powerful truth. It enabled the poor to be seen as profoundly equal to the rich, the weak to the strong, the underprivileged to the privileged, and so on and so on. Not to mention the equality of adults and infants, slaves and their masters, and the equality of people from different racial backgrounds. The consequences have been powerful, and they continue to be, and we should be thankful for that. But what happens to that idea when you reject the God bit? How can you hold on to that idea without the God bit that gives you the idea? If we're going to retain the idea of equality, it now has to reside in what humans have in common in themselves. And that is why Darwin's theory of evolution, was so troubling to many, including Darwin himself. He saw that his notion of the survival of the fittest led to the troubling conclusion that, and I quote, there had come to exist over the course of human existence a natural hierarchy of races. And we know where that led. Now, there's a discussion you'll find difficult to get off the ground. Try that in a phone-in show or something like that, or a letter to the editor. Here's the argument. Try running it. Abandon God, and Darwin's theory undermines, I think unavoidably, the notion of human equality. How can we hold on to the equality of human beings while abandoning the truth that gave us that idea? Now, the answer our world seems to have come up with is complicated and perhaps is still being worked out. After all, we also value diversity, which means welcoming and affirming differences between people. But perhaps equality just means equal rights for people regardless of differences. Well, in that case, it's no surprise that equality has joined rights as a concept that finds much of the Bible teaching offensive. Although it was the Bible that gave us the most powerful basis for the profound equality of all people, the Bible does not fit well with what the concept of equality has become any more than it fits with the rights that have become merely desired outcomes. The concept of equality has also contributed to the intensity of public debates. Once a debate is seen through the lens of equality, the discussion can no longer be calm. I mean, what kind of person is against equality? Only a bad person, of course, a person who approves of inequality. We saw that again in the same-sex marriage debate. It went along that line. Once it was defined as a matter of marriage equality, it was very difficult for an argument for marriage inequality to get off the ground. Only bad people would put that kind of argument, wouldn't they? And so good people didn't try, or many didn't. But the concept of equality that Christianity gave to the world isn't threatened by human differences. Indeed, it allows us to appreciate the goodness of difference without threatening equality. Women do not have to play rugby to be equal to men, nor to men for that matter. Equality is deeper than being the same. All humans are made in the image of God, equally in the image of God. All humans are sinful and in need of salvation, equally sinful and equally in need of salvation. You see, here's a biblical statement of human equality. It goes like this: God so loved the world. Our world's idea of equality, as it's developed, has become expressed in competitiveness, assertiveness, resentment. The biblical concept of human equality leads to this: you shall love your neighbour as yourself. And friends, these two powerful ideas, human rights and equality, have changed the world. And I think it's fair to say they are the beating heart of the moral framework that surrounds us today. But I'm suggesting that they've become corrupted ideas by being detached from their source. The value and dignity of human life has been reduced to distorted ideas of rights and equality. And it is at least in part these corrupted ideas that have made it so difficult for our contemporaries to see the goodness of God and his ways. The Bible tells a better and more powerful and more beautiful story. And I'd like, just for the remaining few minutes, to briefly try and sketch out some further elements in the two stories. See, the rights and equality culture sees what's wrong in terms of the forces, the laws, the attitudes, the behaviours that undermine or deny rights and equality as they are now understood. And this has led to the powerful concept of group identity. Identity is what defines us, makes us who we are, and therefore who it is with whom we identify. In the old days, Christians used to be rightly critical of a culture in which our identity was tied up with our job, our career, our achievements, our status, and so on. That's changed. Identity has become a way of speaking of rights and equality, more particularly of rights denied and inequality experienced. And you're encouraged to identify with those who feel the same injustices. This subject is far too big to take on properly now, but a recent shocking critique of where such ideas are taking us can be found in Douglas Murray's widely read book, The Madness of Crowds, Gender, Race and Identity. And again, I warmly recommend that one, and it's on Carl's bookstall as well. Suffice to say here that the Bible will teach us to see some of the forces, laws, attitudes, behaviours and ideas around us as wrong, but the Bible sees the problem as deeper. The dividing line between good and evil cuts through the heart of every human being, as Solzhenitsyn put it. In our own individual sinfulness and selfishness, we have to recognise our contribution to what is wrong and what is spoiled in human life. The blame cannot all be shifted. We are not just victims, but our own selfishness and sinfulness robs us of thankfulness and contentment and the goodness of responsible living. The solution sought by the rights and equality culture is liberation. Freedom from the forces, laws, attitudes, behaviours, ideas that rob me of my rights and my equality. Freedom from whatever prevents me from being and doing whatever I want to be or do. No wonder the Bible gives offence, because the Bible sees that kind of freedom as no such thing, as nothing of the sort. It's bondage to selfishness. And selfishness spoils everything. That's a subject we could explore at length, but of course not now. Put simply, the liberation that is brought by the gospel of our Lord Jesus Christ is freedom from selfishness, freedom of forgiveness, freedom to be children of God, freedom to live no longer for yourself. And that is brilliantly good. Of course the God of the Bible cares about justice. Of course he cares about suffering, and he cares about cruelty and oppression. But what if he does not regard something you desire very much as a right? Or some difference between the situations of you and someone else as unjust? And what if you see your identity in terms of those things? Then the Bible is challenging your very sense of identity, but it's also offering you a very different and wonderfully liberating understanding of your identity. What if your identity is a child of God, loved, forgiven, and a fellow heir with Christ? Better by far. Now, when the goal of human life is securing your rights and achieving equality and exercising freedom in the senses that we've seen, then the path to happiness is empowerment. Turn the tables. The oppressed, the victims of injustice, must gain power over those who have denied you your rights, robbed you of your equality, and restricted your freedom. And this understanding of life is reinforced by the fact that there are, of course there are, and there have been oppressed people. There have been people who have suffered appalling injustices. There are people who have exerted power over others in terrible ways. Of course, that is certainly true. But if those are the categories in which you think about life, the powerful and the oppressed, because life is about rights and equality, and you see the path to happiness as turning the tables, then you cannot but hear a Bible word like submission in those terms. It means submission to the power of another. It's about being disempowered. It's about perpetuating the problem, not the solution. And that is offensive. But if we understand our identity as forgiven sinners, belonging together because we're joined to Jesus Christ, loved by God in whose image we've been made, then our relationships, like our relationship with God himself, are based on love, not power. The Bible's teaching is about Christian wives submitting to the love of their husbands. Now, that may still cause offence, but it is altogether different from the idea of submitting to their power, which I do not believe the Bible teaches. Now, let's just wrap this up. Someone has suggested, and I've drawn that little table in these terms, someone has suggested that the problem with the Western world today is that it wants the kingdom without the king. And I found that a helpful way of putting it. The Western world has learnt such things as the value of human life, the equality of human beings, the pursuit of freedom, the importance of justice and tolerance, and so on. These values come very, very largely from the historic influence of the Bible on Western cultures. Without that influence, it's difficult to see where those ideas could have come from. They are, we could say, aspects of the kingdom of which the Bible speaks. And as our culture, as our world has rejected the God of the Bible, it has clung on to many of these values of the kingdom, or it's tried to. We want the kingdom, you see, without the king. But the point of what I've been trying to say to you this afternoon is that without the king, the kingdom is distorted, corrupted. And the result is an understanding that actually finds the kingdom of God offensive. The kingdom our world wants, the kingdom without the king, is a different kingdom. And it must be said, it's not good. So I'd like to conclude by returning to the example that I've mentioned several times: wives, submit to your husbands. The distorted ideas of rights, equality, freedom, and power, if those are the ideas you've taken on, you cannot but hear those words as meaning some combination of the following: that wives should be oppressed by their husbands, that wives should be less free than their husbands, that wives should be dependent and husbands independent, that husbands have rights but wives do not, that husbands are superior to their wives. And let us be clear, those ideas are offensive. And we've got to appreciate the strength of that offence and not just bang on using the words if that's how they're being heard. Because what's being heard is a highly offensive idea. We're not being faithful and biblical if we give the impression that that is what the Bible teaches, or anything like that. We could say something similar about many aspects of the Bible's teaching. But as we learn not to be conformed to this world, but to be transformed by the renewal of our minds, we see a very different vision for human life, in which we can appreciate the goodness, for example, of a call to submit to the love of another. We learn to discern the will of God and to see how good and acceptable and perfect it is.
Thanks very much, John. That was really fascinating. You talked about the inadequacy now of the old apologetic model, that we've moved on from addressing apologetic questions with reason and logic. And you've outlined very clearly where the new apologetic should apply. But in practical terms, what does that look like? I totally get what you're saying, but in everyday conversation, what does that new apologetic look like?
Is this still on?
I think come back to this.
Thank you. Let me be quite clear. I think the old apologetic is still relevant. The old apologetic is still important. The old apologetic is really an expansion on what you find in Acts. We are witnesses of these things. They preached the resurrection, and you could know it's truth because here are witnesses. It was encapsulated a historical argument for the truth of the resurrection. That's still valid. I'm saying we need something more as well. So it's not either or. Okay, the more as well is it seems to me needs to address the problem that I've raised of what we are teaching seeming to be morally discredited. Now, I must say that my thinking has begun with how we care for people in our churches and how we teach Christians. That's my starting point. And I think that we need to begin to teach and critique the thinking of the world around us that we're all observing. So we need to learn ourselves to see the world rightly. We need to have a biblical idea, not the world's idea of rights, equality, freedom, and all those sort of things. We need to learn to think more biblically in those ways. We need, in our own minds, to critique the culture around us at those fundamental points. Now, in our interactions with people, I think that those sort of conversations need to go on as well. In a particular conversation, to say, to discuss if you can have a discussion. But if you can have a discussion, it'll be, where does this idea of human equality come from? I believe in human equality, but it comes from, you may be able to demonstrate with a person that their idea of human equality is just sort of arbitrary. They just plucked it out. Because, so it's a similar kind of argument, but it's about the moral issues, not simply the truth issues. It's going to be hard, and I think myself we're just beginning to do it. A lot of people are thinking about it, but I don't know that we've really got very far down the track of doing this, so we're learning. Leslie's asking, how do we start a conversation, a gospel conversation, with a person who says, I'm not interested in that at all because I dismiss it as bigoted or intolerant or whatever. I don't think it's analogous to that poor age when I was a young person. You were too. When science has discredited that. Well, what do? You say, no, it hasn't, And your conversation then goes wherever it might go. It might be an argument about the resurrection. It might have been an argument about what do you make of Jesus. It might, whatever that might have been. I'd say the conversation may be, and that's where these books are quite interesting. The books that I've shown you are all by non-Christian authors. It's almost as though there are non-Christians around who are realising this is not working. And they're a little bit ahead of a lot of us, I think, but therefore you won't want to follow them completely, but they're saying this isn't working, and I think we can help show people this is not working. So where do you think the idea came from of human equality? And you say, it bone up a little bit on the history so that you can actually tell people. It came into the world from Christianity, from Bible teaching. The only reason we got that is that some people had the idea that we've been made in the image of God. Where do you get the idea of human equality from? Tom Holland has got this lovely example where he says, where do you think human beings ever got the idea, listen to this, that it's more noble to suffer than to inflict suffering? Right? It's more noble to suffer than to inflict suffering. Where did that idea come to because it certainly wasn't part of any ancient civilization. That idea just wasn't there. The idea that, and he is absolutely convinced it came from the crucifixion of Jesus. The crucifixion of Jesus, and of course what was then said about the crucifixion of Jesus as the gospel proclaimed by Paul went round the world. But that idea has gripped. Can you find a Westerner who doesn't believe it's more noble to suffer than to inflict suffering? We all believe that. Where did that idea come from? So I think there's a lot of getting into what if you're talking about Westerners particularly, but in one sense everybody's influenced by the West now. And I think that there are moral ideas. You can say, where do you think that idea came from? And you say, I've been reading a book that tells me it actually came from the gospel of Jesus Christ. Would you like to know more about that gospel of Jesus Christ? Because actually that's where your morality came from. He argues that almost all of the conflicts in the modern world are variations. So where does the Me Too movement come from? That was mentioned earlier on. Now, I've got all sorts of problems with the Me Too movement, but the criticism of powerful people taking advantage and harming, where did the idea that that's wrong come from? It came from Christianity. It didn't come from anywhere else. There's nowhere else for it to come from. So I do think that there is a powerful, apologetic might be the right or wrong word, I'm not sure, but there is a powerful kind of conversation for us to have with our contemporaries, because our contemporaries still cling to these ideas, some of which I've touched on. There's a whole lot more. Tolerance is one, but the favourite one I've come across is that idea of suffering, which I think is very powerful indeed. If you do pick up this book and start to read it, or if you manage to borrow a copy, if you don't, because there's only 2 copies out there for Carl, the introduction is a most wonderful description of the significance of the crucifixion of Jesus in the ancient world. Again, I can't make these people out. They're all people who say, we owe so much to Christianity and we're losing it because we've rejected Christianity. The only way to get it back is if lots of people become Christians, but not us. I can't work it out.
Thanks, John. Carl. Yeah.
Thanks, John. Very stimulating. You briefly touched on the conflicted consciences of people we might be teaching, and I think I misunderstood or misheard, because I wrote down we need to avoid overriding Christian consciences to believe truths that we actually feel might be cruel or evil. How does that fit?
No.
Yeah.
Thank you. I think I have been misunderstood because I probably didn't make things clear. We need to teach consciences. Consciences need to be taught. So if your conscience has so imbibed the ideas of this world that it sees the ways of God as wrong, I'm saying it's no good to simply say, no, the ways of God are true, even though your conscience has to be taught. And we have to learn to love God's ways. It can't be right, can't be adequate to simply know they're true. The devil knows they're true. But we must love them. See, how hard is it to love the idea of divine judgment? But the psalmists do. Okay? We don't understand it, we don't get it until we love it and delight in it. Is that hard for us? Of course it is. But we need to learn to love the truth as well as believe the truth. Yeah.
John, you mentioned that the authors that you'd written down were non-Christians.
Can I just qualify that?
Sure.
The Seedon top, or however you say his name, I'm not sure whether he's Christian or not. If he is Christian, I suspect that he's a Catholic, a Roman Catholic. But the others are certainly not Christian believers.
Sure. I'm wondering who are the Christian authors that are writing about this apart from you today or speaking about it? And I'm just wondering if there aren't any, why is that? Are they taking a different approach to handling the issue, or they just, in your words, avoiding the problem or ignoring the problem, or... yeah, sorry.
I don't know, and by all means, if others have authors they'd like to recommend, there are a few. Who was that fellow who was mentioned by someone this morning?
Glyn Harrison.
Yes, yeah. Glyn, is it?
Glyn.
Glyn Harrison is one. He's got a book called A Better Story.
Yeah.
Yeah.
Better Story. He's got a second one out now on... Sorry? Ego. Yes. Thank you.
So that's one author, Glyn Harrison. I think a lot of the discussion of this is going on online, in podcasts and things like that. And I think that there is a lot of stuff out there that it's all beyond me, that world. But in one sense, at least at the depth and extent of what we're experiencing, it's come very, very quickly. And I think it has overwhelmed us, and I don't know that we're really... of course there'll be people far more on top of this than I am, but I think as a fellowship, as a Christian community, I'm not sure that we've really quite woken up to what's happening and to the challenge that we're facing, except for realising it's really, really overwhelming.
John, you were saying that we need to be able to teach the truth and show the goodness of the truth, because we've got to believe the truth, we must love the truth. I guess my question is, what would you recommend on a practical, on-the-ground level in terms of modes of teaching in our local churches or campus groups or whatnot? Because is our current mode of teaching still suited towards a model that assumes that the problem is merely intellectual and, a question of the plausibility of belief? Because it's more than that. You're saying that we have to show the good, the true, the beautiful, the goodness, and why we should love the truth itself. Can you comment a bit on what modes of teaching may need to adapt to in order to do that?
No, mate, you're asking me to be practical. That's way beyond that's above my pay grade. I think that those questions are probably separate. That is, I don't think from a moment that the forms of Bible teaching that we've had are simply intellectual. They shouldn't be. If they are, we're not doing them well. If you're bringing the truth of God to people, that's not just intellectual. It is intellectual, but it's not just intellectual. You're talking about the truth about your very being, the truth about eternity impacting people. Now, in terms of forms of communication, I think a next generation has to think that through. I just encourage you to see that your forms of communication are shaped by what we're communicating. We're communicating a word, a message that has been given to us in words, has been given to us in an inspired book, and don't sort of put that to one side and allow the forms of communication to be shaped by, let me be a little unkind here, the methods of the stand-up comic. Or whatever is popular as a means of communication in our culture is not necessarily, might be stuff to learn from it, there might be stuff to learn from it, but it's not necessarily the right way to communicate the revelation that we have received in the way in which we've received it. So there's thinking to be done. I haven't got all the answers, but to think it through with those sort of constraints, I think is important.
John, you talked about submission to the love of the husband,
Yep.
but not submitting to their power.
Yes.
Would you mind elaborating or clarifying power there, and also what not submitting looks like?
Well, I'm picking up a little bit from some things that Nick said in the last session. I may be moving in a slightly different direction to what he was saying. I'm not sure, and he's not here to disagree with me. I'm so pleased about that. At least I don't think he is he? No, I think he's in another seminar at the moment. I don't think for a moment that it's appropriate to say, to even think that the Bible teaches a woman, a wife, that she must submit to the abusive power of her husband. It's not even on the radar. It's about a husband who's being called to lay down his life for his wife. That's what you're to submit to. And a marriage is a two-sided thing. And if the husband is to love his wife and the wife is to submit to the love of her husband, that's the picture of marriage. If you've got an abusive husband who does not love his wife, then she's not being asked to submit to that. Now, I know it's more complicated than that. I know there are complications you work out, but it seems to me to be right to say that the wife is being called to submit to what the husband is being called to do in that context, and that's submit to his love. I think there are arguments we'll have about this, and there are complexities to this subject that I'm sure I'm not covering by a few lines here, but it seems to me to be really, really important. And if we have, and certainly people have heard us saying, I haven't actually come across it in our circles, to be honest, I'm glad to say, but people are saying that we are telling wives that they must submit to the bad behaviour of their husbands. Well, I want to say, if you have ever heard that idea, stand against it. The Bible is calling wives to submit to the love. Do you submit to the abuse of Jesus Christ? Does the church submit to the bad treatment of the Lord Jesus Christ? No. Well, wives, submit to your husbands as the church submits to Christ. And in the context, particularly the Ephesians 5 context, it's perfectly clear that's not just as the church. Of course, we're obedient to Christ. So there are differences between the church's relationship to Christ and the husband and the wife's relationship to the husband. It's not that the wife does everything that the husband says, even if what the husband says is wicked, because that doesn't happen with the church and Christ. Everything that Christ does towards us comes out of his love for us. And so it seems to me really, really important to get that clear. And I've got a footnote in this thing. There was an article just in the last few months in The Conversation that said something like, evangelical Christians teach husbands to control their wives. Where'd they get that from? I hope it wasn't from any of us.
I think the kind of conversation around group rights versus individual responsibility is often kind of described in terms of left wing versus right wing, and Christians are often lumped in with the right wing politics. And my natural reaction is I want to shake that association off. Do you think as churches we should try to shake that association off, or should we own it? I
think we should be above it. the left-wing, right-wing thing I can never quite work out. It's a funny kind of terminology. I think, from what I can gather, this is not particularly, it's not coming out of a depth of knowledge or anything like that, but I think that what is generally called left and right wing, and we're not talking about extreme expressions of either of those, but what is generally called left and right wing are two things that we need to have together. If left wing emphasises compassion and care for those who are suffering, we need that. If right wing emphasises responsibility and valuing what we've inherited from history, for the good things that have come to us from history, we need that. And those who talk about these things that I've heard say, actually, it's a personality thing. It's not one is correct and the other is wrong, but our personalities tend to one or the other. And that fellow that John Anderson mentioned, Jordan Peterson, insists that with a personality test, he can predict with about 90% accuracy what your politics will be. So if you're high in a particular trait in your personality, then you'll be left-wing. If you're high in another one, you'll be right-wing. And as a society, if we could recognise that, we'd recognise it's not good people against bad people. It's people who have a passion for one aspect of things that are good versus another. Now, can it all go wrong? Of course it can, and it does go wrong. But I think as Christians, we ought not to identify, certainly ought not to identify uncritically with left or right politically or socially. I think there are things that we long to preserve that we realise have come to us from a past that are really good. We don't want to undo it all, so we'll be a bit on the right side. But do we care about people who are suffering, people who are losing out, people who are hurt? Of course we do. You could call us left-wing, but I don't want compassion and thankfulness, put it that way, compassion and gratitude. I don't want them to be set over against each other. That's one of the great false things that are tearing us apart.